Premium quality football shirts at an extremely affordable price. Sound good? If so, check out the sponsor of today's video, jerseyfifa.com. You can see that I've sent you some shirts and they really are top quality, so make sure to click the link in the description to go find a shirt for yourself or perhaps as a gift for someone else. And you can now use code jerseyfifa at checkout for 10% off your order. That's code jerseyfifa at checkout for 10% off your order. I really do recommend their products, so go take a look. Now let's get into the analysis. So let's put this quite bluntly, Manchester United have had a poor season and are some way off from challenging the teams at the top. And obviously, as a result, it's led to a lot of talk of the transfer window coming up this summer. Now, before we get into things, one thing I should say is that the project or rebuild at Manchester United is only going to work if the board and owners are willing to back the next manager. Will that happen? I'm not really too convinced. But despite that, we are going to talk about what United should do in the summer transfer window. But rather than looking at players they need to sign, we're going to switch it up slightly and look at some of the players that might need to be sold. Now, personally, I do think there's an issue in the goalkeeper position because neither player is really good enough with the ball at their feet. But I'm aware that a lot of people are very opinionated on this, so maybe I'll address that in a different video. So let me know in the comments if you want to see that video, but for today we're going to do things slightly differently, and this is going to be slightly more opinion based rather than focusing on the analysis side of things. So let's get started. Now, the first player that Manchester United need to sell from the club is Phil Jones. Jones has been at the club for some time now and he's actually one of the few players that has won the Premier League with Manchester United. But that was of course all in the past, and these days he's just far too injury prone, and unfortunately for him, anytime he has managed to get a slight chance in the team over the past few years, he has ended up getting injured and therefore missing a spell out of the team. He just hasn't had a run of games in the team for several years now, and whilst it might be harsh to have this mentality of getting rid of him because of injuries, at the end of the day United have to put their own interests ahead of everything else. Phil Jones is a player that United really need to get off the wage bill. It's reported that he earns between 75 and 100,000 per week, and when you're paying a player that much to play 3 times a year, then it highlights what's wrong in the club. One last thing on Jones, I do think he is a real credit to himself, and the work that he's put in over the past couple of years to even get back into contention in the first team is extremely impressive, because it has been hard for him both on and off the pitch. But now it's time for him to move on, free up some wages for Manchester United, and hopefully find himself a new club where he can stay injury free and revive his career somewhere in the top flight. We are going to continue with the centre back position, and next up on the list is the captain of the club, Harry Maguire. Now, this one I'm not entirely convinced on because he has quality, but let's take more of a look at the situation. Now, Maguire first showed his quality for Leicester and England, which earned him a move to Manchester United for £80 million, and I don't care how good you think Maguire is, this was really poor from United to spend this amount of money on him. Don't get me wrong, Maguire was very impressive for Leicester for a couple of seasons, and he was deserving of the move to a so-called bigger club. But there was just no way that his performances warranted an £80 million move last summer. Despite massively overspending, I do think that Maguire has repaid Manchester United to some extent with some really good performances, and after a slow start at the beginning of last season, I think he had a really impressive year at the heart of the defence. And personally, despite the hate I will get for it, I personally think he is a very decent centre-back. Is he at that absolute top level? No. But is he still a very good centre-back? Yeah, I think he is. It all depends on the system. The evidence for this is Maguire's England form. Despite his struggles at club level, he has consistently performed well for England for nearly 4 years now, and people seem to forget that systems have an effect on the centre-backs as well. Now, whilst I have just defended him, it's important to look at both sides of the story, and there is no escaping the fact that his form for United this season has been an absolute shambles, and he looks a shadow of the player that he was just last season. So with all of that in mind, I do personally think that it is time for Maguire to move on from Manchester United, and with the negative feeling that fans now have towards him, it would probably be best for everyone involved if he was to move on. The question is, where would he go? Well, I don't want to throw names out of different clubs who should try and sign him, but personally I think he is suited to a team with a more pragmatic approach, where Maguire wouldn't have to play in a high line where his pace gets exposed. The big issue is, who on earth can afford him? The problem when you sign a player for £80 million and then pay them just under £200,000 per week is it makes it incredibly difficult to move them on to another club. Another player who is in a similar situation is Busaka. To be fair, I do think this particular one divides opinions slightly more than Harry Maguire, because some seem to want him to play whilst others want him to be sold as soon as possible. So again, let's go back to the beginning when Busaka had just produced a very good season with Crystal Palace, where his defensive numbers were extremely impressive, and to be fair, he did look like one of the top young defenders in English football. However, yet again, Manchester United massively overspent on him, and whilst he may have been good that year, he certainly didn't look like a £50 million player, and ultimately that's what United have been suffering from ever since. So, like with the other players on the list, I would like to give Busaka some credit. He's definitely up there with the best when it comes to being a defensive fullback, and personally I enjoy watching him defend in a 1 versus 1 situation. In particular, the way that he slide tackles is extremely satisfying to watch, and more often than not it gets the job done for him. And again, you really can't argue that he is one of the best 1 versus 1 defenders currently playing in world football. The issue is that his defensive side of the game is meant to be his strong point, yet he still gets caught out far too often for my liking, and whilst he may be physically good in a tackle, his reading of the game and positioning can be extremely poor at times. Despite that, his defensive numbers are still very impressive, and at a quick glance you see several green bars and think that this is an impressive FB ref report. But if you take a closer look you begin to see the issues, and I just want you to focus on the passing stats. To put it simply, Busaka isn't good enough with the ball at his feet to play in a modern day top side, simply because he doesn't have the technical ability for teams that want to dominate and really dictate matches. As a result of this, I think that Busaka needs a move elsewhere, to a team that sees less of the ball where he can show off his defensive capabilities. So I'd like you to let me know which club you think he should move to in the summer transfer window in the comment down below. But one thing to keep in mind is the price issue. Again, United spent a lot of money on him and currently pay him around £90,000 per week, so it's going to be difficult for a smaller team to come in and pay him a wage that he is happy with. Another player on a similar sort of wage is Jesse Lingard. Now for me this is a bit of an odd one, because it feels like transfer should have happened some time ago, but we'll come back to that later. But first let's take a look at where things started. Lingard is one of the few players on the list that didn't come with a large transfer fee, as he instead came through the famous Carrington Academy, and to be honest, I do think this makes it a little bit sadder when a player has to be sold from the club, having come through the academy. To be fair, Lingard has had a pretty decent time at the club, and under Jose Mourinho in particular, he had a real purple patch where he scored a lot of goals, and he's also had spells where he's really grabbed important goals for the team. This good form has also seen him making numerous England squads, and at the World Cup in 2018, he played a big role in the side, and about 4 years ago, it did look like his career was heading back in the right direction in an upwards trajectory. But his inability to create chances for his teammates when playing against a low block has seen Lingard's career turn on its head, and he's been pretty much spent the last couple of seasons just sitting on the bench with an occasional appearance. There has been one bright spell for Lingard in the past 2 years, and that was his loan move to West Ham last season, where to be fair he really was on fire, and he must have felt like being on top of the world, scoring goals week in, week out. For me, this is where it went wrong. Having managed to get his form and confidence up for half a season with West Ham, it was the perfect time for Jesse Lingard to leave the club. His price tag would have been higher, and everyone involved would have been happy. But for some reason Solskjaer seemingly wanted to keep him at the club for this season. Obviously, we don't know what promises were made, but Ollie convinced him to stay at the club, but then simply didn't play him while he was still at the club during the first half of the season. This has left Lingard as another one of those players that gets paid around £90,000 per week to sit on the bench and not really do anything. And again, I'm not really too sure who can afford to pay the wages that he'll now demand. One club that probably could is Newcastle. They obviously have a lot of money these days, and I do think it could be the sort of move that would work for Lingard, and I also think it would improve Newcastle. So actually, I think this could work. Now, the last player on the list is Marcus Rashford, and this is probably the most confusing and difficult one to really figure out and understand. But as with everyone, let's start at the beginning and then move forward from there. So of course, as with Lingard, Rashford is a player that has always been at Manchester United as he progressed his way through the Carrington Academy, before then eventually getting his chance to play regularly for the first team. Rashford's debut almost felt like fate, as both Martial and James Wilson were both out of the side through injury, which meant that Rashford got his start and he really hasn't looked back since, scoring on his debut and again in his Premier League debut a few days later. And the goals and high points just kept coming. During his short career so far, he's taken a lot of responsibility on his shoulders in some absolutely huge moments, regularly stepping up ahead of some far more experienced players at the club. Rashford's peak so far probably came during the 2019-20 season, when he really carried the team on his shoulders almost single-handedly, before Fernandes then joined the club in January to give him a little bit of an extra hand. Perhaps the most impressive thing is that Rashford done all of this whilst carrying numerous injuries, and he really did put the club before even his own body, and he was playing with multiple injuries in his shoulder, back and his ankle for a long time. Rashford finally took a short break after the disappointment of the Euros to have surgery on some of his injuries, but ultimately he just hasn't been the same since, and to be honest, his form this season hasn't been good enough for a Manchester United player. This has led to a lot of frustration and even abuse from Manchester United fans, and for me it's completely unwarranted. Being disappointed is fine, but in no situation should players face abuse for poor form. These are human beings we're talking about, and personally I think it's time for something extremely rare to happen, and that's for football fans to have just a little bit of patience. And personally I think Rashford is a top player, and I think United would soon regret it if he was to move elsewhere. Personally I think Rashford just needs an arm around the shoulder, but perhaps more importantly he needs a manager or coach which is really going to help him develop, something that I would argue he has never had in his career so far. So overall I think what this video has done is highlight how difficult the task at Manchester United is, because it's going to be so hard to find any clubs that can pay the wages of some players, whilst others will require just a little bit more patience. But as always I want to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.